Hey, everyone. Welcome to today's story. I know you're all here for something a little darker, a bit more unsettling, so grab a seat, maybe turn down the lights, and get comfortable. What you're about to hear are 3 real stories, experiences from babysitters who found themselves in situations they couldn't explain. If you're a fan of stories that blur the line between the real and the supernatural, these ones are for you. My name is Olivia. I've been babysitting for years now, and in all that time, I thought I had seen everything. Kids are unpredictable, parents can be quirky, and the hours can be long. But nothing prepared me for what happened at the Adams house that night. It was a typical Friday evening, or at least I thought it would be. The Adams family had hired me for the weekend, as they often did. They were an older couple in their mid-40s, both professionals, and their 2 children, Ben and Lily, were relatively easy to watch. Ben was 10, and Lily was 8. They were well behaved, and the house was spacious, too spacious, I later realized. The house itself was one of those old, brick homes built on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees that seemed to grow a little too close to the windows. It had an air of mystery to it. No one in the neighborhood ever seemed to visit. The front yard was overgrown with ivy, and the driveway was long and winding. At night, when the wind picked up, the trees cast long, eerie shadows across the windows, and the house had a strange, hollow echo to it. I had arrived around 6 p.m. The parents were in a rush to leave for a dinner party, as usual. They gave me the usual instructions: feed the kids, get them ready for bed, and don't let them stay up too late. I nodded and watched as they sped off in their car, leaving me alone in the quiet, dimly lit house. The kids were already in the living room when I entered, playing some board game on the carpet. I greeted them, sat down, and tried to get into the mood for the evening. We had dinner, watched a few cartoons, and by 8:30 p.m., it was time for bed. That's when things started to feel off. I tucked Lily into her bed first. She was quiet, unusually so, and kept glancing around the room as though she was waiting for something. Her room had always felt a little colder than the rest of the house, but I chalked it up to the large window that let in the night air. She whispered something to me as I was about to turn off the light. "Olivia, don't go down to the basement." I laughed nervously, thinking she was just being silly. "There's nothing down there, Lily. It's just a basement. You're fine." But she didn't seem convinced. Her eyes were wide, and there was a tension in her voice that unsettled me. I brushed it off as typical childhood imagination. Kids are always scared of basements, right? I moved to Ben's room next. His room was on the 2nd floor, at the far end of the hallway, right above the basement. Ben was already in bed, staring at the ceiling. I told him good night and started to leave, but he called me back. "Can you leave the door open a little?" he asked quietly. I didn't think much of it. The house was large, and I suppose he wanted the extra light. So, I left the door cracked open and went to sit in the living room for a while, scrolling through my phone. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard it, a faint noise coming from below. I assumed it was just the house settling. Old houses creak and groan, especially at night. But then it happened again. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like something, or someone, was moving down there. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably just the pipes or the house, but the sound was unnerving. It grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't like a typical creak, it had a cadence to it, almost as if something was pacing the basement floor. I got up to check on the kids, just to reassure myself. Ben was still in bed, his door ajar as I had left it. He didn't stir. But then, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. The door to the basement, which was just off the kitchen, was slightly cracked open. I distinctly remembered it being closed when I first arrived. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I cautiously approached the door, my heart racing. The thumping from below had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting in the dark. I knew I shouldn't have, but I opened the door. The basement stairs stretched down into a thick darkness. The overhead light was flickering, casting uneven shadows across the stone walls. I could feel the temperature drop as I stood there, hesitant. The air smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. That's when I heard it again, a soft scraping sound. It was coming from the far end of the basement. My stomach twisted into knots. My breath felt shallow, and my legs felt like they were made of stone. I shouldn't have gone down. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the nearest flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the first step. The basement was just as creepy as I remembered. Old furniture covered in dust, boxes stacked haphazardly, and piles of what seemed like forgotten memories. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. The sound, the scraping, was louder now, more insistent. It came from behind a stack of old boxes. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam flickering nervously. As I rounded the corner, I froze. There, lying on the floor, was an old rocking chair. But it wasn't still. It was rocking back and forth, gently, as though someone had just gotten up from it. There was no one else in the room, and I hadn't touched it. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. I backed up slowly, but then, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but then it grew clearer. Olivia. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was low, raspy, and familiar. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the stairs. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. I ran back up the stairs, my breath coming in short gasps, and slammed the basement door shut. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, my pulse racing. The house was eerily silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I went upstairs, checked on Ben and Lily again. Ben was still in his bed, but Lily was sitting up, her eyes wide. Olivia, she whispered, her voice trembling. I told you not to go to the basement. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't explain what had just happened, but the truth was, I didn't want to be there anymore. I stayed in the living room, keeping an eye on the kids, but I kept the lights on and didn't leave their side for the rest of the night. When the parents returned later, I didn't mention anything. I simply packed up and left. I never went back to the Adams house after that night. Something about it, something about the basement, felt wrong. I still don't know what it was, whether it was just my imagination running wild or if something else was there. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never forget the sound of that rocking chair. Second story. My name is Harper. I've been babysitting for a while, mostly for families I've known through mutual friends, and usually in well-lit, safe neighborhoods. I had never really had any bad experiences, and I thought I had a good sense for the kinds of situations to avoid. But that night, everything changed. It was a stormy evening when I accepted the job. I had been sitting at home, bored and restless, when I got a call from a family I had never worked for before. They were desperate, had a last-minute dinner engagement, and needed someone to watch their 7-year-old daughter, Mia, for a few hours. They lived in a house out on the outskirts of town, a place I'd never been before. The weather had turned sour by then, and the wind was howling outside. I hesitated for a moment, but the offer was good. I figured it was just a regular babysitting gig. I left my apartment around 7:30 p.m., just as the rain began to pour in torrents. The streets were slick, the headlights of passing cars blurred by the downpour. I had to drive about 25 minutes to reach the house, which was located at the very edge of a wooded area. As I pulled up to the driveway, I noticed the house looked almost isolated. It was a large, two-story building, set back from the road with an overgrown yard. The windows were dark, with only a faint light glowing through one of them, as if the place had been abandoned for years. I wasn't sure why, but there was something unsettling about the house. The kind of quiet that was almost too still, even with the storm outside. I tried to shake off the feeling and rang the doorbell. A woman opened the door, her expression tense but polite. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Mia's upstairs in her room. I've already left her dinner, but she might be a little nervous with the storm," the woman said, handing me a set of keys. "You'll be fine. Just stay with her until we get back." She didn't seem overly friendly, but I didn't think much of it. I just nodded and went inside. The house was dark, with the only light coming from the hallway lamps, and the air felt heavy, as though the storm had seeped into the walls. The sound of the rain hitting the windows and the occasional thunder rumbling outside only added to the eerie atmosphere. I climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, where Mia's room was. When I knocked on the door, I heard her faint voice from inside, inviting me in. Mia was sitting on her bed, staring out of the window at the storm. She had a pale, delicate face, and her wide eyes seemed to look right through me, almost unnerving in their intensity. She didn't smile when I entered, which was unusual for a child. "Hi, Mia. I'm Harper. Your mom said you were feeling a little nervous about the storm," I said gently, trying to ease her into the night. She nodded slowly but didn't say anything. I walked over to the window and glanced outside. The wind was picking up, and the trees were swaying violently. The rain pelted the window, making it difficult to see anything clearly. I turned to face Mia. "Do you want to watch a movie, or maybe read a book to distract you?" She shook her head, her eyes never leaving the window. "I don't like when the lights flicker," she whispered. "It happens when the storm gets bad." I gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll be fine. The power usually stays on, even in heavy storms. You don't have to worry." But even as I said that, the lights in the hallway flickered. My smile faded. I could feel the unease growing, but I didn't want to scare Mia more. I decided to sit with her for a while, turning on the TV and letting her watch cartoons. I tried to engage her in conversation, but she barely responded. Instead, she just kept staring at the window, her face pale, as though she was waiting for something. Around 9 p.m., the storm was at its worst. The house groaned and creaked, the wind howling outside. The lights flickered again, and then everything went black. I froze. The sudden darkness in the house felt suffocating, almost too real, like the storm had swallowed it whole. The sound of the rain pounding against the windows was deafening. I fumbled around for my phone, quickly using the flashlight to illuminate the room. "Mia?" I called softly, my voice trembling slightly. "It's okay. I'll go check the fuse box." I didn't want to leave her alone, but I had no choice. I needed to fix the power before it got worse. I left the room, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark hallway. The house felt so quiet now, almost too quiet. As I reached the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft thump, followed by a light scraping sound. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound came from the bottom of the stairs, faint but unmistakable. It was as though something, or someone, was dragging something heavy across the floor. My heart began to pound in my chest. I tried to calm myself. It was just the wind, the house settling, maybe the rain hitting the windows. I took a deep breath and made my way down the stairs, the beam of light in front of me shaking slightly. The scraping noise continued, now louder, as though it was moving closer. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment. The house felt wrong, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I turned toward the hallway that led to the kitchen and the basement door. The basement door was wide open. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to gape at me, black and inviting. I didn't want to go near it, but the scraping sound was now unmistakable. It was coming from the basement. "Mia?" I called, my voice high and tight. There was no response. I started toward the kitchen, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I reached the door to the basement, and as I peered inside, my flashlight flickered. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move at the bottom of the stairs, but when I blinked, it was gone. My pulse was racing now. I should have just left. But I couldn't. I had to check. I had to make sure Mia was okay. I turned to run back upstairs, but before I could make it to the first step, I heard Mia's voice. It was soft, almost a whisper. "Harper, don't go down there." My blood turned cold. I spun around, but Mia was standing in the hallway behind me, her eyes wide and full of fear. She was looking down the stairs at the open basement door. I told you about the basement," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't care to know anymore. I grabbed her hand and rushed up the stairs, my mind racing. I couldn't get out of that house fast enough. When the parents arrived later that night, I didn't say a word about what had happened. I've never gone back to that house. The storm, the basement, Mia's warning, there was something in that house, something I couldn't explain. I don't know what it was, but I'm certain it wasn't just the storm. And I'll never forget the look in Mia's eyes when she whispered, "Don't go down there." Third story. My name is Karen. I've been babysitting for a couple of years now, and over time, I've gotten used to all the usual things: cranky toddlers, kids who don't want to go to bed, and the occasional mischievous pet. But what happened to me one rainy evening in a house I'd never been to before still sends shivers down my spine. It was a Friday night, and I had just wrapped up a shift at my day job when I got a call from a new client. The Jennings family needed someone to watch their 8-year-old son, Henry, while they attended a wedding. It was last minute, but the pay was good, and I figured it would be a quick and easy gig. They lived out in the countryside, about 30 minutes from my place. It had been raining heavily all day, and the skies were dark, but I wasn't about to turn down the job. I arrived at their house around 7:30 p.m. The moment I turned onto the long driveway, I felt that familiar unease settle in. The house was tucked back behind tall trees, and the driveway was barely lit, with only a couple of old lamps casting shadows on the wet gravel. The house itself was large, too large, I thought, and had that slightly overgrown, forgotten look to it. Ivy clung to the brick, and the front yard was filled with dead leaves. The whole place looked as if it had seen better days, but it was quiet, too quiet. Mrs. Jennings greeted me at the door, her smile tight, but polite. "Thank you for coming, Karen. Henry's upstairs in his room. He's a little shy, but you'll be fine. Just make sure he gets to bed by 9:30, okay? And don't worry, The house is old, so it'll creak. Don't let that scare you, she said, her voice a little too quick, as if she were trying to convince herself. She handed me the key, gave me a brief rundown of what to do, and then left. I waved goodbye and shut the door behind me, taking a moment to shake off the feeling of discomfort. The house was much darker inside than I had expected. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, and there was an odd, musty smell in the air. It wasn't terrible, but it was the kind of smell you get in places that haven't been aired out in a while. The hallway light flickered as I walked down the corridor to Henry's room. The air felt thick, and the house seemed to groan with each gust of wind outside. I knocked on Henry's door and was greeted by a soft voice telling me to come in. Henry was sitting on his bed, surrounded by books and toys, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked up as I entered, but didn't smile. "Hi, Henry. I'm Karen. Your mom said you're going to stay up a little longer tonight?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He nodded but didn't speak. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach tighten. His eyes were a little too wide, his movements a little too stiff. But I didn't think much of it. Kids sometimes act strange when they're in a new situation. "I'm just going to get ready for bed," he said softly, almost like he was talking to himself. I decided to let him be for a bit. I went downstairs to make myself comfortable and turned on the TV. The wind howled outside, and the rain had intensified, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound on the windows. I glanced at the clock. It was 8:30. I figured I'd wait until 9 to start getting him ready for bed. As I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too still. The only sound, aside from the storm, was the occasional creak of the wooden floors. It was as though the house was alive, breathing with the wind. Every so often, I'd hear something faint, like a door creaking or a whispering sound, but I figured it was just the house settling. At 9 p.m., I made my way upstairs to check on Henry. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw him standing by the window, staring outside. The dim light from the hallway made his face appear pale, almost ghostly. "Henry?" I called softly. "It's time for bed." He didn't turn around at first. I walked up to him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, let's get you to bed." He flinched at my touch and spun around, his face twisted with fear. "Don't go down there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't go where, Henry?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "The basement," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's not safe." I felt a chill run through me. The basement? What was he talking about? But before I could ask more, Henry abruptly sat down on his bed, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place, something I didn't want to think about. "Henry, listen. I'll be right back. I just need to check on the basement to make sure everything's okay," I said, trying to reassure him. He shook his head furiously. "Don't. Please. They're down there." "Who?" I asked, my voice shaking now, despite myself. He didn't respond, just stared at the floor, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Something in my gut told me I shouldn't go near the basement, but my curiosity got the better of me. I left his room and headed for the stairs that led down to the basement. The staircase creaked under my weight, and as I reached the bottom, the air felt colder, heavier. The basement door was cracked open, and the faint smell of dampness hit my nose. I hesitated. I shouldn't have been there. but I couldn't help it. I had to see for myself. I pushed the door open, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb hanging in the middle of the room. The walls were lined with old furniture, cardboard boxes, and what looked like piles of old clothes. Everything in the basement seemed to be covered in dust, untouched for years. And then, I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. The air felt thick with a presence that wasn't mine. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner. There, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a figure. A shadow, just barely discernible, but undeniably there. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone, but somehow, I managed to step backward, my mind racing. What was that? Who was that? And why was it in the basement? The whispering grew louder. I couldn't understand the words, but it sounded like it was coming from more than one voice, layered on top of each other, as if several people were speaking at once. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, but I could hear something behind me, following me, just out of reach. As I reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the basement door shut with a force I didn't know I had. When I got back to Henry's room, he was still sitting on the bed, his eyes wide with terror. "You went down there, didn't you?" he asked, his voice breaking. I nodded, my throat dry. "I'm sorry, Henry. But there's nothing down there. It's just a basement." He didn't respond. He just stared at me, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "They're always there," he whispered. I couldn't bring myself to ask him more. I left the house as quickly as I could, not even waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Jennings to return. I haven't taken a job out there since. The house still haunts me, especially the basement. What was down there? What was Henry so terrified of? I don't know. But I don't ever want to find out. Well, there you have it. A night that didn't end the way I expected, but one I'll never forget. I wish I could tell you that it was just a figment of imagination, but deep down, I know what I felt, what I saw, and the fear that stayed with me long after I left. Maybe it was the house, maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, I know one thing for sure: some things are better left unexplained. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe out there.